The light fade. The observation deck of the Stellar Council's high spire was designed to inspire awe. Floor-to-ceiling crystal windows offered a sweeping view of the galactic spiral stars twinkling like the heartbeat of the universe. But today, Representative Gray stood with his four-fingered hand pressed against the cold pane, and all he felt was dread. Beyond the breathtaking vista, something was wrong. Something deep. Something ancient. And it wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a silence. In his other hand, a report pulsed softly with unread alerts. It wasn't numbers that chilled him. It was the pattern. Civilizations old, proud, brilliant were going dark, not from war, not from disease, from within. Representative, a gentle voice called behind him. Gray didn't flinch. His assistant floated closer, a being of pure sentient light, encased in a containment frame of delicate silver filigree. The councils assembled. Gray nodded slowly. How many worlds now? 17, the assistant replied. In the past month alone. Gray closed his eyes. And the symptoms? The same, the assistant answered. Loss of will, halted scientific advancement, art abandoned, culture crumbling. They eat, they breathe, but they no longer strive. The words hit like a slow knife. Gray turned from the stars and made his way to the chamber below, where the fate of the galaxy was being decided not with weapons, but with whispers and fading light. The council chamber was a vast circle of power, each seat a testament to a world that had once reached for the stars. Some representatives were biological, others digital. A few shimmered with quantum existence beyond matter. Yet today they all looked the same, exhausted, dulled, dim. Council Head Bright, a crystalline entity older than most empires, called the session to order. Her once blazing form flickered like a dying ember. Representative Gray, the floor is yours. Gray stepped to the center, hands trembling slightly as he activated the holographic display. The air filled with charts, pulses, and planetary reports. But no one looked surprised. They had seen versions of this before. Just not so many. The pattern continues, Gray began, a voice steadier than he felt. We have now confirmed 32 advanced civilizations experiencing what we've termed the dimming. He tapped his interface. Images filled the air. Empty cities, abandoned halls of science gardens, overgrown and wild. Places that once teemed with innovation now stood silent. The Noor have not launched a single starship in 3 years, Gray continued. The Bright Collective has deactivated half of its power networks. The crystal minds, once able to write poetry that resonated with gravitational waves, haven't produced a single line in decades. A wave of uneasy murmurs passed through the chamber. These weren't fringe colonies. These were the beating hearts of galactic progress. We've tried everything, Gray said. Neural reconfiguration, artificial incentive programs, emotional catalyst generators. Nothing works. They survive, but they do not live. The spark is gone. A representative of the Mernari, Ishi, a race of logic-driven intelligences, spoke up, its voice like 1,000 steel blades. Is this a contagion? No pathogen, Gray replied. No common vector. Only correlation. They are all highly advanced. Civilizations that once shaped stars now can't be bothered to plant trees. Another delegate whispered, then we are facing extinction. Not through violence, not through conquest, but through entropy of the soul. For a moment, the chamber fell into complete silence. Not respectful silence, hollow, dreaded. Gray's console blinked. He paused, frowning. Excuse me, he said, checking the alert. His eyes widened. A sliver of something pierced his exhaustion. Counselor Bright, he said slowly, I believe you'll want to see this. He tapped the console again. A new image appeared in the air. A small, unremarkable blue-green planet in a remote arm of the galaxy. No galactic standing, no ambassadors, no influence. They call it Earth, Gray said. Holographic zoom-ins displayed strange scenes, people rebuilding ruins, cheering for failing rockets, hugging after earthquakes, painting joy into broken alleys. Primitive, chaotic, messy. And yet, we've been monitoring this world as part of our low-tier development study, Gray explained, and we found something unexpected. Images of humans flashed, a child planting flowers beside a collapsed home, a scientist laughing after a failed experiment, a group of strangers forming a chain to save someone from a flood. They struggle, constantly, Gray said. They fail, repeatedly, and still they try again. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the chamber. They call it hope, Gray said. It's not just emotion, it's action, purpose. Even when everything tells them to give up, they don't. Bright's crystalline form flickered with a faint pulse. And you think this hope could cure the dimming? I don't know, Gray admitted. But I know this, they still reach for the stars. And they do it with nothing. No council, no tech, no certainty, just belief. The council chamber fell silent again. But this time it wasn't dead air. It was the silence before a storm, before something changed. Send observers, Bright said softly. And just like that, the first embers of a forgotten fire began to glow. A blue planet among ruins. The emergency session stretched into its 4th hour. The chamber lights dimmed to conserve energy, symbolic, really considering what they discussed. No one spoke of new technologies anymore. No one proposed a cure for the dimming. Because for the first time in galactic history, the smartest minds admitted something chilling. They had nothing left, except Earth. In the back row of the council chamber, a young researcher named Pine sat frozen. She was small, barely recognized, a junior analyst in a division that cataloged developing worlds. Her skin, leaf-like and veined with soft bioluminescent green, rustled every time she shifted nervously. And right now it was trembling like a leaf in a solar storm. If she didn't speak now, Earth's window might close forever. If no one has anything else, Counselor Bright intoned, her crystalline form flickering with fatigue, we'll adjourn and reconvene once the Mindstream Coalition completes. Wait! The word came out too loud, cracking through the silence like lightning. All eyes turned. Pine felt her throat seize, too late now. I have something to share. A pause. Then Representative Gray, still worn but watchful, nodded. Please proceed. Her hands shook as she inserted her data crystal into the console. A new projection lit the chamber Earth again, but this time overlaid with data streams. Visuals danced around the room. Thunderstorms, forest fires, riots, and crumbled buildings, and right next to them, hospitals humming with life, classrooms buzzing with noise, children playing, artists painting on broken walls. We've been monitoring Earth for 5 decades. Pine began, voice quaking. Their patterns don't make sense. They are, inefficient, reactive, chaotic. They sabotage themselves economically, politically, environmentally. But she tapped the console. The imagery changed. Now came scenes of humans rising from the rubble again and again, volunteers rushing into floodwaters, strangers donating food they barely had, a boy learning to walk again after losing both legs, smiling as he stumbled. They fail constantly, Pine said. They lose loved ones. Their systems collapse. Their leaders lie. And yet, they rebuild. They reconnect. They try again. Not out of logic, not even out of reward, but because they believe tomorrow might still be worth something. A mechanical voice cut in, cold and clinical. Such behavior is statistically irrational. I know, Pine replied firmly now. That's what makes it powerful. She brought up a new clip, a city leveled by an earthquake. Dust, blood, sirens. Then just days later, chalk drawings on the pavement. Children laughing while buildings still burned behind them. They have this thing, Pine continued. They call it hope, not as a slogan, as a reflex. It doesn't come from data. It comes from somewhere deeper. Something we've lost. The chamber grew still. Dozens of species beings of gas crystal metal flesh watched the flickering images of a broken world that somehow kept dancing through the ashes. Gray stood slowly. He was looking not at Pine but at the images. Show us more. So she did. A sculptor rebuilding a monument destroyed in war using fragments from the battlefield. A father comforting his child under a collapsed roof. A blind musician playing a song that made strangers stop in the rain and weep together. They don't hide their pain, Pine said. They transform it into connection, into meaning. Another clip, a woman repairing a shattered vase not to make it perfect, but to fill the cracks with gold. A whisper from the gallery kintsugi. They celebrate flaws, Pine said. They use them to tell better stories, to become something stronger. They don't seek perfection, they seek beauty in the struggle. A slow murmur spread across the chamber. This is, Art asked a representative from the Silicon Alliance. There is data in these images, but also emotion. Yes, Pine nodded. They don't just express emotions, they multiply them. Share them, turn individual pain into collective healing. The Bright Collective representative pulsed for the first time in days. We have forgotten such expression. And yet they remember it, Pine said, even with no external reward, even with no certainty. Gray looked up at the massive image of Earth. Maybe, he said, voice low but caring, that's why they've survived the dimming. Not because they're strong, but because they never expected certainty. Because uncertainty is the only world they've ever known, and they turned it into an art form. Pine added gently, maybe they're not unaffected by the dimming. Maybe they've simply learned how to outrun it. The chamber buzzed, not with dissent, but with something new, something quiet, something daring to be optimistic. Let us observe them further, Counselor Bright said at last. Not as specimens, not as inferiors, but as teachers. And for the first time in months, the council didn't end with silence. It ended with purpose. Hope in chaos. The rain was relentless in London that day, cold, gray, and unforgiving. Ambassador Reid stood silently beneath a street awning, his silver environmental suit gleaming under neon signs. Droplets slid down his visor like tears he didn't yet understand. Around him, humans bustled by with umbrellas, soaked coats, and wide smiles. Remarkable, he murmured into his recorder. They find joy, even in this. 3 months had passed since the council dispatched observation teams across Earth's major cities. Reid had chosen London, its contrast between history and modern chaos, between resilience and reality. He expected complexity. He didn't expect humanity. Inside a small coffee shop across the street, he saw an elderly man wave a stranger, barely more than a teenager, over to share a cramped table. 2 minutes later, they were laughing like old friends. Reid blinked. There were no protocols, no social scripts, no shared identification tags or caste markers, and yet they connected. Initial assessment, he recorded. Social bonding appears instinctive, unscripted, highly adaptive, illogical. His communicator buzzed, a transmission from Mumbai. Reid came Stone's voice, another observer. Are you seeing this too? They keep helping each other, without command systems, without reward triggers. I'm watching it now, Reid replied. They call it courtesy, or sometimes kindness. It appears foundational. I just watched a man give his lunch to a stranger, Stone said. He looked hungrier than the person he helped, and yet he smiled afterward. Reid stared through the window again, where a young girl was offering her scarf to a shivering dog. That's what we're here to understand. Later that afternoon, Reid visited a local gallery, small, tucked between 2 busy roads, but filled with more energy than any crystalline museum on the bright homeworld. Humans stood in silence before paintings and sculptures, some weeping quietly, others smiling, all lost in feeling. Reid paused in front of one particular piece, a broken ceramic vase, its cracks filled with gold. A voice beside him explained, it's called kintsugi, Japanese. It means repairing what's broken and making the flaws part of the beauty. Reid turned slowly. The gallery owner smiled gently. They say it shows how something can be more precious, not despite the damage, but because of it. He recorded the entire conversation. Here was a culture primitive by galactic standards that didn't just survive pain. They elevated it, painted it, played it, danced it. That night, Reid found a street performer under a flickering lamplight. A crowd gathered. The song was about heartbreak and loss, sung in minor chords, but the people watching were smiling. Some even danced. Daily log, Reid whispered into his recorder. They embraced sorrow not as weakness, but as a bridge, a thread of connection between strangers, a way to remember they're not alone. A commotion broke the music. Screeching tires, a crash, gasps. A car had skidded in the rain and nearly hit a pedestrian. Before Reid could react, a dozen humans already had. One pulled the driver out of the vehicle, another knelt by the victim. Someone called emergency services. Another offered their coat. No commands, no hierarchy, just instinct. The driver, visibly shaken, asked first, "Is she okay?" A stranger helped him sit, offered water. A woman who'd been running late still stayed to comfort the crying pedestrian. Reid's voice trembled slightly as he spoke into the recorder. Most fascinating behavior, yet selflessness. In high-stress environments, humans default to aid, prioritize others, even if it delays their own goals or safety. The rain fell harder, no one cared. This species wasn't advanced in the way the council defined it, but Reid had a growing suspicion their true power wasn't technological. It was emotional. Elsewhere across oceans, other observers reported the same pattern. In Sao Paulo, a boy shared a handmade toy with a crying child after a school burned down. In Manila, strangers formed a human chain to rescue families from floodwaters. In Detroit, a community rebuilt a burned-down house together, one brick at a time. All without orders, without reward, without perfection. In Paris, an observer watched a man spend hours composing music with nothing but broken instruments and scraps of wire. In Lagos, children painted murals over crumbling walls, images of stars, trees, and people holding hands. Each moment was small, but the collective weight of them felt revolutionary. These weren't acts of survival. They were acts of defiance against despair, against failure, against the very entropy that had choked the stars. And every act said the same unspoken truth: we are not perfect, but we will not stop trying. Reed compiled his report that night, the lights of the city twinkling beyond the window, like constellations of emotion. Summary, he began, voice steady. Humanity's power lies not in dominance nor in intellect, but in an unrelenting commitment to meaning. When everything breaks, they build. When everyone falls, they reach out. When there's nothing left to win, they still fight to feel. He paused, then whispered the final entry. They don't survive by avoiding the dimming. They survive by creating light wherever it tries to take root. And maybe, just maybe, that light was contagious. First contact hearts, not tech. The transport ship descended through the lavender haze of Novar Prime, its silhouette slicing across clouds that glowed with a dying kind of beauty. The once glorious world had become quiet. Its crystalline towers no longer sang, its people no longer glowed. At the forward viewport, Captain Abigail Moore stood in silent reflection, her breath slow, controlled. Behind her, 5 other humans checked their suits, not for weapons, but for comfort. They weren't soldiers, they weren't diplomats. They were something more dangerous. They were human beings, flawed, real, and unshakably alive. Moore turned to face them. Remember, she said, voice calm but resolute. We're not here to fix their tech. We're not here to analyze their psychology. We're here to share the only thing that matters. She touched her chest. Our humanity. The ship would touch down with a whisper. No crowds waited, no trumpets, just silence. Representative Gray stood at the landing pad, his pale blue skin a shade paler than when the humans had first seen him via hologram. He looked tired in ways that transcended biology. I must warn you, he said, voice subdued. 3 more tower communities shut down this week. They haven't moved, spoken, reacted. Then that's where we'll start, Moore replied. Gray blinked. You have? No equipment. Moore hefted her bag. Inside, a guitar, crayons, journals, Polaroids, warm bread wrapped in cloth. No equipment, she repeated. Just stories, songs, and a whole lot of stubborn love. The tower was like a mausoleum made of diamonds. 10,000 Novari, once radiant crystalline beings, now drifted through their existence like ghosts. Their inner lights, once pulsing with color, barely shimmered. The team split up. Tom, a former homeless man who now ran a soup kitchen back on Earth, set up a basic cooking station in a common area. The scent of warm bread and spices filled the sterile halls. Slowly, curiously, Novari began to appear, drawn not by hunger, but by memory. Maria, a disaster survivor who had rebuilt her entire town, shared stories of hurricanes and wildfires, of loss and rebuilding. Her voice was low, gentle, inviting. Elders began to gather, listening in silence. Some wept crystalline tears. Jack, a retired teacher, sat on the floor and started teaching Earth games, simple clapping rhythms, storytelling rounds, imaginative puzzles. Novari children, unsure at first, began to mimic, then laugh. Their laughter rang like chimes through the tower, the first such sound in years. Lisa, an artist who had worked with war refugees, set up a painting station. But instead of teaching technique, she handed out colors and said, "Show me what you feel." The Novari hesitated. Then one dipped a finger into deep red pigment. Another swirled blue into arcs across the canvas. Emotion repressed for decades exploded into color. David, a street musician, wandered through the halls, playing melodies from his modified guitar, adjusted for crystalline resonance. The entire structure responded, humming softly in harmony with the notes. The walls remembered music and they ached for more. "What are you doing?" a young Novari asked, approaching Moore as she passed out slices of bread with Tom. Moore smiled. "We're living." The Novari blinked. "Living? For what purpose?" Moore paused, then offered her answer with a shrug. "To feel, to connect, to remind you how." "May I join?" Moore handed her a plate. "Please." Progress was slow. Some Novari remained hidden in their chambers. Others watched with suspicion. But the humans didn't push. They offered, waited, invited. And something began to change. One day, a Novari child invented a new game mixing Jack's Earth rules with traditional Novari movement patterns. It was awkward. It was clumsy. It was perfect. An elder who hadn't spoken in years began telling stories again, this time not of ancient glory, but of what they had seen that week: children painting music, echoing bread shared without need. Lisa's art room expanded. She began teaching Novari to use their own crystal dust as pigment. Their creations began to glow not just with light, but with emotion. And then came the blackout. A power fluctuation plunged the tower into total darkness. No one panicked. Instead, Moore gathered everyone she could into the central atrium. They sat on the floor. Jack lit a single candle. "Story time," he said. One by one, the humans told tales of Earth, of lost survival, stubbornness, laughter. The Novari listened in pitch black, their forms glowing faintly with each word. Then one light flickered, then another, then a dozen. By the end of the night, the room glowed with collective bioluminescence, the strongest it had been in years. They hadn't fixed anything. They had simply reminded them how to be alive. Representative Gray watched the humans from a balcony, jaw slightly slack. His assistant hovered beside him, voice quiet. "They are not healers." No, Gray agreed. "They are not trained in neural restoration." No. Then why does this work? Gray watched David teaching a Novari child to strum a single chord, the crystal fingers clumsy but eager. Because hope, he whispered, isn't a technique. It's a choice, and humans, they've made that choice more times than any species I've ever seen. By the end of the month, the tower was unrecognizable. Novari lit corridors with personal sculptures. Children played games with invented rules. Music played at all hours. Elders told stories late into the night. Energy consumption doubled, not from despair, but from activity, creativity. A new art form was born: light weaving, with emotional intent, fusing human rhythm and Novari resonance. David played music in a duet with a Novari elder. Lisa helped create a mural across an entire wall, flawed, chaotic, and utterly beautiful. They didn't erase the cracks. They painted them gold. When the humans returned to the landing pad, Gray stood waiting. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at them. "You brought no machines, no drugs, no equations." Moore smiled. "We brought something better." "And what is that?" She glanced at her team, tired, messy, laughing. "Hope," she said. "The kind you bake into bread. The kind you paint into scars. The kind you share with someone even if you barely know their name." Gray looked past her at the tower. Lights flickered, music rose, laughter echoed. Novar Prime had not been fixed. It had been reminded. From bread to belief, the message arrived quietly. No ceremonial encryption, no flashing diplomatic seals. Just 6 words blinking in plain font across the Stellar Council's main terminal. "Send more humans, please." It wasn't from the Novari alone. It was from 5 other civilizations. 5 civilizations that had heard whispers of what happened in a single tower on a fading world. 5 civilizations who, for all their advancements, had forgotten what it felt like to wake up with purpose. The council chamber, once a graveyard of despair, now buzzed like a hive catching its breath after a long winter. Representative Gray placed the message in the center of the display for all to see. Then he placed something else, a small crystalline sculpture, imperfect, cracked, its flaws filled with shimmering gold. A gift from Novar Prime. "Art," Gray said softly, "inspired by humans." Around the room, alien delegates leaned forward. "We called it the Human Initiative," Pine began, now standing beside Gray as a senior observer. Her green skin glowed with subtle excitement. "But the Novari are calling it something else, the human approach." Images rotated in the air. Novari children painting alongside human volunteers shared meals around simple tables. Light songs played on hybrid instruments. One image showed Tom teaching a child how to knead dough. "They're not just learning to live again," Pine said. "They're learning to share, to teach, to care. No fanfare, no doctrine, just humanity exported one gesture at a time." Within weeks, the initiative expanded. A new team was dispatched to the bright collective, whose once shimmering forms had dimmed until they barely reflected starlight. Humans didn't bring energy converters. They brought dancers. In zero-gravity chambers, beings of light watched as humans moved to music, spontaneous, emotional, chaotic. And then tentatively, the lights joined in, pulsing and flickering in rhythm. They had no words for joy, but now they had motion. In the gas giant Bellis, the cloud minds, once fluid and poetic, had become still, stagnant, devoid of novelty. They no longer formed stories. So humans told theirs. Children floated in sealed pods and spoke of underdog heroes, impossible odds, and bittersweet victories. At first, the minds listened in silence. Then they began to swirl. Slowly at first, then with colors no one had seen in centuries. They started responding not with facts but with fiction. They dreamed again. In the Silicon Alliance, the most logical and machine-perfect civilization in the quadrant, no one expected progress. Their last cultural update had been 93 galactic cycles ago. They requested children. Pine herself delivered them well recordings at first. Children explaining why rainbows mattered, why monsters under the bed were sometimes metaphors, why building sandcastles was meaningful even when the tide always won. The Silicon Alliance rewrote their core code to include one new parameter: excitement of uncertainty. Their first new creation in decades, a randomly generated poem titled "Maybe Today Something Beautiful Happens." The change wasn't immediate, it wasn't explosive, it was viral. Civilizations didn't just copy human actions. They began imitating human processes, making mistakes, forgiving them, finding strength in loss, bonding through humor, painting without patterns, dancing without choreography. The Novari sent artists to the Bright Collective. The Silicon Alliance began coding translations of Cloud Mind stories. The Cloud Minds adapted human lullabies into memory loops that induce sleep not for rest, but for dreaming. Worlds once isolated by ideology now connected through emotion. And at the center of it all, unnoticed by most, were humans. Not leading, just being. Pine compiled the latest report watching as images flowed across her screen. A mural painted by 5 different species. A communal festival where no translators were needed because music did the talking. A sculpture built with shattered remains of old technology, reformed into something new and breathtakingly unuseful. "It's happening," she whispered. The dimming wasn't just slowing, it was retreating. In one of the newest towers on Novar Prime, Lisa sat beside a young Novari artist as they painted a wall together. "Why do humans help?" the child asked suddenly. Lisa dipped her brush in gold and answered without thinking. "Because we know what it's like to be in the dark." That night, a small group of humans gathered in a quiet room back on the observation ship. There were no council members, no reporters, just the original team: Tom, Maria, Jack, Lisa, and David, seated in a circle, sharing leftover bread and stories of what they had seen. No one made speeches. They didn't need to, because they knew the truth. This wasn't a mission. This was a mirror held up to a galaxy that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. And somehow, a few imperfect humans reminded them. Not with power, not with perfection, with bread and belief. The human approach. It began with one mural. A Novari child painted their version of hope. Bold strokes, chaotic color, jagged lines that shimmered and flickered like an unstable star. But what stunned the observers wasn't the image itself. It was who helped paint it. A member of the Bright Collective, a being of pure light, had pulsed its essence in rhythm with the child's strokes, creating a glowing ripple through the pigment. It was the first cross-species art ever made. And it wasn't perfect. That's why it mattered. In the Stellar Council's grand chamber, Pine stood before the gathered representatives, a holographic slideshow whirring behind her. The images stunned them into silence. A Bright Collective dancer flowing to the beat of earthborn jazz, its body of photons shifting colors it hadn't displayed in millennia. Cloud Mind philosophers co-writing bedtime stories with human authors, blending old Terran fables with vapor, language, abstract symbology. Silicon Alliance logic nodes uploading recordings of children laughing, not for analysis, but because, as one stated, it makes our calculations softer. "We called it observation," Pine said, "but it's become integration." She paused, then added something no one expected. "They're not just learning from us anymore. They're learning from each other." The Novari launched a program called Flawed to Light, a cultural exchange that encouraged species to showcase their imperfections and how they grew from them. The Bright Collective responded with a dance format where mistakes were incorporated into final movements. Chaos turned into grace. Cloud Minds began crafting impossible questions inspired by Earth's love of paradox. What is the color of forgiveness? Can a machine long for a mother? And the answers they received weren't always logical. That apparently was the point. Humanity's influence was no longer just emotional. It became structural. Universities reopened not just for learning, but for play. Libraries added music halls. Councils began every session, not with policy briefings, but with shared stories. The most surprising change came from the Silicon Alliance. For generations, they had run the most precise predictive algorithms in the galaxy. Now, after exposure to human children and art, they added a new variable to every projection: hope factor 1 unknown. And with that inclusion, their predictions became more accurate. Because hope, it turned out, wasn't blind optimism. It was an engine. In the field, human volunteers now work side by side with alien communities. Tom taught soup recipes on frozen moons. Jack helped a species with non-verbal communication design, a tactile storytelling game using sound and vibration. Lisa led collaborative art projects where each species brought their own flaws, fractures, limitations, quirks, and the final product was a mosaic of beautiful imperfection. David performed to packed amphitheaters of alien life forms with no ears, just vibration-sensitive skin. He didn't care. They felt it anyway. In a recent report, Reed observed, "They are not mimicking us. They are becoming something new with us." He watched a Silicon Logic being dance with a Novari sculptor while a human girl clapped in time. "We weren't the cure," he wrote. "We were the reminder." The council met again for emergency review, but this time the emergency was different. Pine stood beside Gray as holograms shifted behind them, showing a galaxy not only waking up, but coming alive. "The dimming isn't just ending," Pine said, "it's being replaced." "With what?" asked Counselor Bright. "With connection," Pine answered. "With new patterns, new ways of thinking, a new kind of civilization fueled not by control but by meaning." Some representatives were skeptical. "They're still primitive," one mechanical envoy said, "barely out of their solar system." "Yes," Pine smiled, "which means they've had to live with uncertainty their entire history, and they never gave up. That's not weakness. That's training." Gray added, "For the first time, we're not just advancing forward, we're advancing together." On a distant moon, a child of the cloud minds whispered a story to the wind, and a Silicon listener translated it into poetry. On a space station orbiting a dead world, bright collective beings choreographed a memorial dance for the species that had succumbed to the dimming. And in a Novari tower built from broken towers before it, murals glowed from wall to wall, each one painted by a coalition of hands, claws, tendrils, and energy forms. All of them signed not with names, but with symbols that meant still here. Humanity had not saved the galaxy, but they had done something rarer. They had helped it remember itself. And now the galaxy finally was starting to create again, not because it needed to, but because it wanted to. A galaxy reborn. 1 year after the first human team landed on Novar Prime, the Stellar Council called a special gathering. This time it wasn't for crisis management. It was for celebration. Delegates from every affected civilization arrived in waves, each one transformed not by power or policy, but by something no sensor could measure. Something that pulsed beneath their skin, their code, their photons. Hope. The council chamber no longer echoed with silence and dread. Now it vibrated softly, humbly with life. And as the first speaker stepped forward, the change was undeniable. It was a being of light. "We thought we had mastered energy," the being said, his voice resonating like distant bells. But it was sterile, cold. "Now our youngest glow with colors we believed extinct. We have learned that the strongest energy comes from connection." A unit from the Silicon Alliance followed next. "We were built for logic," it said, and then paused, a pause full of choice, not delay. "Humans introduced us to flaws, to paradox, to emotion. We feared it would corrupt us. Instead, it clarified us. Hope has improved our predictive models by introducing possibility." Then came a cloud mine, its swirling form dancing with thought patterns more vibrant than any had seen in centuries. Once we processed information, now we imagine. The chamber erupted not with applause, for many species didn't clap, but with waves of light harmonic chimes, magnetic pulses, and cascading colors. Each species celebrated in its own way. Together it was symphony. And among them, watching quietly from the observation gallery, were the original 6 humans. More. Tom, Maria, Jack, Lisa, David. Just people. Representative Gray stepped onto the platform. His voice, once tinged with resignation, now carried something firmer, something alive. "The humans did more than interrupt the dimming," he said. "They reminded us what we left behind in our pursuit of advancement." He lifted the small sculpture from Novar Prime again, the cracked crystal filled with gold. "We thought perfection meant eliminating flaws. They showed us embracing them makes us whole." More delegates came forward, not to speak of success, but of transformation. The crystal minds now composed poetry in collaboration with their formerly silent outcasts. The energy weavers had begun composing art with intentional distortion, declaring beauty should sometimes be uneasy. The thought shapers developed new teaching systems that incorporated conflict as a learning tool modeled on human classrooms, where wrong answers were part of growth. The biggest surprise came when a young Novari stepped forward, glowing with radiant confidence. "I was born into the dimming," she said. "For me, silence was normal. Emptiness was expected. Then the humans came not to fix us, but to sit with us, to listen, to play, to laugh." She raised both arms. A hologram burst across the chamber, showing her tower now fully alive. Novari painting beside silicon thinkers. Cloud minds telling bedtime stories to children of light. Humans walking among them, not as leaders, but as neighbors. "We are not what we were," she said. "We are something new." From their seats above, Tom leaned toward Moore. "Did you ever think sharing bread would lead to this?" Moore didn't answer right away. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "No," she whispered. "But I think that's the point. You never know which act of kindness becomes the spark." Jack nodded, adding softly, "We didn't just light candles. We reminded them where to find their own matches." As the session neared its end, Counselor Bright, her crystalline body now radiant again, stood for the final declaration. "The humans have a saying," she said, carefully enunciating the Terran words in common galactic standard. "The whole is greater than the sum of its parts." She looked around the chamber. "Today we are more than we were, because of what they gave us. Not technology, not power, but the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to feel, and the wisdom to keep going even when the path is broken." Outside in the great plaza surrounding the council station, a new monument was being built. Not of perfect marble or unbreakable alloy, but from reclaimed materials, from fallen towers, fractured data cores, and even dust from collapsed memory banks. It was imperfect. It was alive. And across its base in 1,000 languages was carved a single word: Hope. The Festival of Hope. 5 years after the dimming was declared a galactic crisis, Ambassador Reed stood at the same window, where Representative Gray had once watched the stars in silent despair. But now the view had changed. The spiral arms of the galaxy still glittered, but there was something different in their light, something warmer, more alive. Behind Reed, the council chambers buzzed with anticipation. For the first time in recorded history, they weren't gathering to legislate, debate, or rescue. They were gathering to celebrate. The first Galactic Festival of Hope was about to begin. Pine approached her leaf-patterned skin, now etched with artistic symbols gifted to her by the Silicon Alliance's new school of abstract aesthetics. "Still hard to believe, huh?" she said, smiling. Reed nodded slowly. "When we first observed Earth, we thought we were reaching down to help a primitive world." He looked out across the stars where ships of all shapes and species arrived in a slow, glowing dance. But it turns out, they reached up and pulled us all back from the edge. The opening performance defied physics. Novari crystal singers resonated across the chamber, while bright collective dancers flowed through the harmonics, painting emotion with every movement. Cloud minds joined in with undulating memory threads that spun visuals midair. Memories of sorrow, survival, and triumph. Silicon beings shifted light panels to accentuate beats, while human voices rose imperfect but powerful, threading the whole into a unified celebration of persistence. And through it all, humans danced not at the center, but among everyone, equal, essential, part of something greater. Captain Moore stood beside Tom, watching their former teammates' children play tag with young Novari and gas-formed cloudlings. The kids had invented their own game, a strange combination of storytelling, mathematical riddles, and chase. It made no sense. It made perfect sense. "Remember when we first arrived," Tom said, chuckling. "We were scared we'd mess something up diplomatically." Moore smiled, her voice warm. "Turns out all they needed was someone to play with them." The centerpiece of the festival was the Gallery of Transformation, a living exhibition curated by every species that had survived the dimming. It wasn't just beautiful. It was honest. A mural of failures that led to breakthroughs. A sculpture made entirely of broken tools and instruments, each piece telling a story. A poem written by a joint AI cloud human collective where every line ended with, "And we tried again." Representative Gray led a delegation through the gallery and paused before a simple hologram projection. 6 humans, sharing bread, teaching games, laughing. "This is where it all began," he said. A delegate from the bright collective pulsed softly. "Such simple moments." "Exactly," Gray whispered. "That's where real hope lives, not in systems, not in certainty, but in kindness, in laughter, in the hand that reaches out when everything feels lost." The final event unveiled the Hope Gardens, a space designed not for one species but all. Crystalline plants shimmered beside light sculptures. Thought patterns floated in shared pools. Fragments of old war monuments were turned into fountains of color. And throughout it all, human touches, patches of grass, painted stones, musical wind chimes tuned to earth scales. Children ran barefoot next to floating beings. Old rivals sat together on benches, not talking politics but comparing poetry. In one corner, a human child placed her hand against the Novari crystal formation. A bright collective flickered beside her. "Pretty," the child whispered. The Novari chimed in agreement, the light being pulsed with joy. And in that moment, Reed realized what they had really done. Humanity hadn't just shared hope. They had taught the galaxy how to build it, together. From the dark came not just light, but life. And in the space between stars, a new truth had taken root. Hope is not an emotion. Hope is not a strategy. Hope is the blueprint of tomorrow. And thanks to one fragile, stubborn, chaotic little species called humanity, the galaxy remembered how to draw it.